So what I want to talk today about, what I want to talk about today is sort of the key question that happens after the revolution, where the United States negotiates the Treaty of Paris and finds itself in possession of half the continent, at least on paper. That is, the Treaty of Paris assigns the United States a territory from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast and roughly from the Mississippi through the Trans-Appalachian Mountains. So a vast territory beyond the original 13 colonies. And this raises the sort of central question about what does America do with the West? How do they understand the West, expand the West into the West? And this key idea, what is the West to the United States? What is all this unsettled territory to the United States? Raises two central problems. The first is, how do you expand into this territory? And that is, how do you expand into it in a way that allows the United States to retain it as part of the Republic, as opposed to losing it to splinter colonies that might attach themselves to either the Spanish Empire in the South or the British Empire in the West, or at some different times, the French Empire also in the West. So how to expand into this territory and maintain it? How to also expand into this territory and expand the Republic without creating the sorts of problems that the British colonization of North America created that led to rebellion. So that's one set of problems. How to expand in terms of the politics, the physical nature of that, the economic nature of that, the social nature of expansion. But the other big question is what to do with the native population. Because this vast territory that has been granted to the United States is actually not an unsettled wilderness, but rather the homeland of a multitude of native peoples. And this is one of the things that is super important as we go through this material, is to realize that for most of the founding fathers, most politicians in this founding era, and also for most people in the first generation post-revolution, these two sort of truths are simultaneously in their heads at all times. On the one hand, they think of North America as an unsettled wilderness. And there's all kinds of ideological reasons why they think about this. They don't consider indigenous people to have settled the land properly. That is, they haven't created private property regimes. They haven't created government that's representative in a way that is recognizable to an English or Anglo settler. And for this reason, this is allowed sort of through a kind of intellectual conceptual leap for Europeans to keep imagining North America, because it has been formed into recognizable regimes of property as unsettled wilderness. So on one hand, there is this sort of vast idea, and this is, I think you can find this as part of American popular culture from the fact that presidents always talk about taming the West as an elemental part of America's experience, to things that you could use in the classroom, like say the Schoolhouse Rock video Elbow Room, which is from the 70s, but is a sort of 2-minute explainer of American history that is kind of focused on the Frederick Jackson Turner version of America as an expansion into the West. So this is one of the central ideas that's super important for Americans, for American politicians, for American settlers, the idea that the West is the promise represented by North America. That is, it is a space of free land, unsettled land, and that's the point of moving here, immigrating here. But simultaneously held with this idea of the West as unsettled wilderness is the idea of the West as Indian country. And so both these things sort of coexist in people's minds at the same time. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance. Now, let me switch to my slideshow here. So this vision for what to do with the West, I think is expressed, as I said, when I think about this vision as being a part of that idea, that thinking about the West as unsettled territory. It's represented in a map like this one, the Thomas Jefferson Hartley map. It's a map that Jefferson has created as part of his assignment in Congress to come up with a land policy for the expanding United States. In fact, this is a map that he comes up with as he develops the original land policy in 1784. This land policy will morph into the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which we will talk about today. That ordinance is really important because it lands at the same time as the Constitution, which gets rid of the Articles of Confederation and establishes the constitutional government of the Republic. Those documents are kind of equally kind of constitutive of this sort of American Republic. This is the blueprint that Jefferson imagines. And as you can see here, one of the hallmarks of this political imagination of the Northwest Ordinance and the sort of way in which it will allow the U.S. to unfold or expand into the West is an idea that sort of erases any native presence. So Jefferson's original vision here, which I think in this map is up to 12 states. This will be changed later on with the Northwest Ordinance to 5 states. But in this original map, I think it's just really evocative of this idea about thinking about the territory as unsettled wilderness, and that this is the inheritance that the U.S. has won from the Revolution. And this idea about the West as unsettled wilderness, you can also take a look at here. These are original maps of the colonies post-revolution, 1783. These are maps that are being drawn up in the US. You can see that the US has sort of cordoned itself off from the Floridas up to the Great Lakes, the Louisiana Territory, which will become part of the US following the Louisiana Purchase. And then below that, you can also see this sort of maps that the US is making, where they are sort of accounting for this territory west of the Appalachian Allegheny Mountains. Most of the states make claims to territory in the West. In fact, they have staked their sort of future on their ability to claim that territory and incorporate it into their states. States like Virginia, states like Connecticut, states like Massachusetts offered scrip as payment for their soldiers during the Revolutionary War. So rather than paying them in cash, they were given land scrip in the Ohio country. It's a vague term that gets used for the sort of greater upper Midwest, the territory west of the Alleghenies going out to the Mississippi. And most of the states claim this through their original charters, which were granted during the colonial period. Those charters, often granted by the British Crown, were seated in the East Coast, where Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts and Virginia all had their original sort of colonies, but also envisioned the expansion or extension of that colony deep into the interior, as you can see from this map. Now, this idea that the territory beyond the original 13 colonies belongs to the United States post-revolution, and that it is unsettled territory meant to be claimed, is expressed pretty early on. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 7, writes that we have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States. He notes that we have heretofore had serious and animated discussions concerning the right to the lands which were ungranted at the time of the Revolution, and which usually went under the name of Crown lands. So this is in reference kind of to this map. You have different states contending ownership over various territories in the West. As I said, they want this territory because both they promise it in lieu of payment to soldiers who fought in the revolutionary armies, but also because the U.S. is broke coming out of the revolution and envisions, and also with no federal income tax, are envisioning the tax scheme exists through tariffs and also will exist through land sales. So most of the states are envisioning getting themselves out of a fiscal hole by selling land or making land available for sale. And so this is one of the things that's animating the states as they move from the Articles of Confederation to the Republic, is figuring out how to claim that land and incorporate it into the Union, but also within their states. This sentiment about thinking about the West as unsettled territory, again, remember I said this is the big question. What do we do with the West? Hamilton, as early as the Federalist Papers, so before the Constitution, is making an argument that this land, which had been previously called Crown lands, in other words, they're recognizing this as land that had been claimed by Great Britain through the right of discovery and was part of the British Empire and was recognized as unsettled, albeit part of Britain, and that the Treaty of Paris had transferred that land to the United States. This idea doesn't go away. This is a statement from the 1848 Free Soil Convention in Ohio. So coming out of the Revolution, particularly post 1787 Constitution, where you have slavery increasingly sort of being a factor for how Americans are trying to navigate expansion, you have the emergence in the North of the Free Soil movement, which becomes very important political movement that eventually will give rise to the Republican Party. The Free Soil movement is in part based on the idea that there is that this is the bounty and promise of North America, that it is unsettled land, free land, and that this ability to claim that land is what makes the Republic possible. As opposed to, say, territories in Europe where all land is part of the Crown or owned by landed gentry. The idea is that in North America, you have available land that will allow a republic to function, because the citizens of that republic can be yeoman farmers. They'll have an independence by virtue of their capacity to claim, occupy, and improve land, which will give them an independence that is required for the exercise of their political rights in a republic. They need to be independent as opposed to being beholden to a landlord class or something, or an employer. So the Free Soil Convention states that it is well known that during the War of Revolution, several of the states laid claim under their respective charters to territory between the Alleghenies and Mississippi. It is also well known that the federal Congress claimed the same territory as unoccupied lands, which originally belonged not to the colonies, but to the crown, and had been wrested from Britain by the common blood and treasure of all the states. So this is the Free Soil Convention. Again, Free Soil are positioned themselves against slave power and the expansion of slave states in the South. Keep in mind that as we exit the period after the Revolution and after the creation of the Constitution, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin, when King Cotton is expanding to the South, there is in the North sort of fear of slave power and the expansion of slave power, and the Free Soil movement sort of emerges as the chief sort of contention against that. And the idea is that this free territory or unsettled territory or unclaimed land, which had been crown chartered territories, have now been transferred to the federal government. So this idea is a common idea in a sort of American political discourse. And of course, this is a map of the same Northwest Territory. It's not fully, it doesn't fully account all for the Indian villages that are in the Northwest Territory, this territory claimed as unsettled or crown lands by the Free Soil people, by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 7. But it is to give you a sense of this territory, especially if you're not super familiar with the upper Midwest. But this territory here, this line, this is the Ohio River. And this is a principal sort of area of settlement there's a whole lot of Native communities that are super important in terms of the politics of the Revolution. Post-Revolution, a lot of these tribes are part of a confederacy along with the Iroquois in upstate New York that had fought with the British, that had also emerged after the 7 Years' War, where the British fought against the French. And this sort of confederation of tribes represented essentially a sort of a trans-regional confederation of people, tribes from the north and the south, that is north of the Ohio River and below. So from, say, Kentucky through Michigan, Wisconsin, and out into Minnesota, down into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. All these areas were occupied by Native peoples. And so this territory was not, in fact, an empty wilderness, but the sort of territory of a vast array of Native tribes. And so as America begins to expand into the West, we're thinking about this, what to do with this Western territory. This sort of process, these two things, how does America expand into the West, and what do we do with Native peoples, are very much in the forefront of people's minds. And to give you a sense of how much this is so, I think it's easy to think back, particularly from a sort of 21st century standpoint, when you could be from a place like Ohio or Indiana and really not have a lot of contact with Native people, not have any Native tribes, as opposed to just being north of Ohio and Michigan, where there are 14 federally recognized tribes, for example, or similarly in upstate New York or Wisconsin or Minnesota. But you could be in a place like Ohio and Indiana where removal was pretty effective, and not grow up with a sort of consciousness of that territory having been Native territory. And so kind of in contrast to that, as I mentioned, these sort of ideas about how does America expand and what do we do with the Native population are very much two ideas that are sort of dissonant, but nevertheless occupy the sort of public discourse on the West and America and expansion. And to give you an idea of how much this is so, I want to walk you through a series of bas reliefs that are carvings that are in the Capitol Rotunda. So a lot of you guys, I think, are junior high school teachers. My son went to the Capitol, I think, in 7th or 8th grade. I think those kind of Capitol trips are pretty common. Capitol Rotunda now is festooned with all kinds of decorations. But at the time when it is sort of first sort of debuting around 1830, the Capitol had been sort of burned during the War of 1812, and the reconstructed Capitol, including the Capitol Rotunda that we now have, opens up for the public in 1830. And at the time, the decorations are much more sparse in the Capitol. Each wall of the rotunda is decorated with a bas relief carving commissioned by John Quincy Adams. And these carvings are meant to sort of tell the story of America. And so this is a good juxtaposition for history teachers in terms of thinking about mythology versus history, and how Americans told stories about themselves. And it's important in this sense to thinking about, this is the period from the 1820s and 1830s. So a sort of full generation after the Revolution, America is conceiving of itself in things like public art, or public infrastructure with the Capitol Rotunda. And these 4 bas relief photos that tell the story of America begin with this picture here. This is the preservation of Captain Smith by Pocahontas, that's carved out in 1825. This is the classic tale of Pocahontas saving John Smith from Powhatan. The next panel is the landing of the Pilgrims, also completed in 1825 in the Capitol Rotunda. This is Squanto greeting the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. Both these sort of panels represent moments of transfer. There are sort of moments that are really important in the mythology of the United States: the Pocahontas moment, the landing of Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, and the arrival of Squanto to save the day. These are important because they're moments of transfer that sort of symbolize this sort of indigenous welcoming of Europeans to the New World, and also even really kind of the marrying of the two cultures. In the case of Pocahontas, literally the marrying, as Pocahontas marries a settler and sort of gives birth to the New World fusion of Europe and indigenous North America with her own family. Or a more figurative sort of birthing of a new world that you see here with Squanto, who in this case you can see him showing or holding out a cob of corn to the Pilgrims. So the mythology around Squanto, of course, is that he shows the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World by planting corn, beans, and squash, and sort of learning to sort of live in a North American space. And of course, the difference between that mythology and the history is that Squanto is able to converse with the Pilgrims because he's been taken captive and brought into Europe, where he lived for years and acquired English. And by the time he gets back to Massachusetts, he finds his village wiped out by virgin soil epidemics. And as part of his sort of reestablishment of himself among the Wampanoag Indians of Massachusetts Bay Colony, carves out a role for himself as a sort of intermediary between these new arrivals, the Pilgrims, and the indigenous population of Plymouth Bay Colony or Massachusetts. And then there are, the third panel is a panel called William Penn's Treaty with the Indians. If you can see, this is completed in 1827. This panel, if you look at it closely, you can see that William Penn is holding a treaty that's 1682. William Penn quite famously got the largest tract of land ever awarded to an individual. The King of England gave this land to him through Crown Charter. That treaty represents the fact that William Penn, recognizing that he would need, in fact, to negotiate that transfer of land with the native peoples, negotiated a treaty with the Lenni Lenape, or the Shawnee and Delaware Indians, the Delaware Lenni Lenape Indians. And the treaty that he's holding, 1682, is that famous treaty that negotiated this transfer of land. So again, a land transfer, but one that signifies a sort of peaceful and diplomatic transfer. Again, a sort of positive cohabitation between the arrivals from the Old World and the original inhabitants of the New World. And the final panel completed for the Capitol Rotunda is the conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians, which is completed in 1826, 1827 time period. And this too is a moment of transfer, but it is a more violent moment of transfer. It's one that is a moment of conflict. Daniel Boone and this native person are fighting on top of the body of a dead Indian. This is also the only panel commissioned by President Adams that is post-revolution in terms of the mythology that he's chosen to symbolize the sort of origin and evolution of America in the New World. So it's this sort of complete journey from the colonial period to the early national period. And the other important thing that I want to emphasize is that every single one of these panels has Native people in it. And every single one of these panels shows American settlers, the people who are either colonists or later, in this case with Daniel Boone, citizens of the Republic, wrestling not only for to carve out a place for themselves in the world, but doing so in conversation or dialogue or in some sort of relationship to Native peoples. So in this time period, in the colonial period, in the transition to the Republic, and even in the period after the Republic, when Americans are thinking about themselves and their place in the world, they very much think about themselves as Americans in relationship to the land and to the indigenous inhabitants of the land. So you can see by the time we get to a place like this is Jefferson's vision that looks at North America and imagines Indians as not here, a complete erasure. But that is juxtaposed with these other images of Indians that are simultaneously in the minds of Americans, that are thinking about themselves in a conversation with Native peoples about who has what rights to the land and how those rights are defined. So this is very much the sort of kind of conversation that is happening in the period of the early Republic, and this sort of cognitive dissonance between this vision of North America as empty and this vision of North America as a place where settlers are wresting control of the continent from a savage population that is living in unsettled wilderness, exists in the minds of Americans at the same time. It's a bit of a contradiction, but it is one that is super foundational for the American experiment. And to give you another idea of this, how these two things do coexist, I have a quote here from George Washington. So it's also important to note, this quote comes in the context of the revolution has come to an end. The Treaty of Paris has brought an end to the revolution, and Congress has been formed, in this case, the Articles of Confederation Congress. And the very first committee that is formed in the Congress is the Committee on Indian Affairs. And in this case, James Duane, who's the chairman of that committee, writes a letter to George Washington and asks him, what should our Indian policy be? And George Washington gives an extensive answer. The long and short of it is that our Indian policy is our land policy. And so let me read you this quote really quick, where he says, and this is farther down in the letter, I debated giving this to you, but I think it's too long and too convoluted to use for teaching junior high school students. But to give you a quick quote, this is George Washington writing to James Duane, who's asked him, what is our Indian policy? And he basically says our Indian policy is our land policy. And then he says, at first view, it may seem a little extraneous, but I'm called upon to give an opinion about the terms of peace proper to be made with the Indians, that I should go to the formation of new states. But the settlement of the Western country and making a peace with the Indians are so analogous that there can be no division of one without involving considerations of the other. You can find this is in the writing of George Washington. It's the letter of September 7th, 1783. You can find that a lot of these collections of presidential papers are digitally available through libraries, at least university libraries. You can often get these digitally because the copyright is no longer sort of working. So even post-COVID, you can kind of track this down. If you track down this letter, it's excellent. It conveys other issues that he's worried about. The fact that in the revolution, Native people sided with the British. He's worried about land jobbers and what he calls bandits settling the Western territory. And that if this is allowed to happen, they're going to lose control of the Republic, that is, will lose control of that territory, because we can't have sort of unorganized settlement. So he's worried about sort of squatters going out and claiming land that the federal government wants to claim. And not only claim it, like I said, really sort of capitalize on it. That is, take that land, survey it, make it available for sale, and make money off the sale of that land. So he's concerned about all these different things. This letter, this letter from Washington sort of, again, kind of brings together these two strands of thought, that North America is a wilderness waiting to be settled by European immigrants or settlers, and also that it is Indian territory. And this brings together those two strands of thoughts. Jefferson's map, which envisions that place as empty, and then gives you a sort of method for creating new states out of that empty space, meets up with George Washington, who's fought the war and has dealt extensively with Native peoples, and his knowledge that that plan is going to bump up against the reality of Native peoples who are living on that territory. And as he's saying, essentially, if we're going to expand, we need to do so by creating peace with the Indians. And this lesson is sort of brought home in the aftermath of these things that we're talking about, the creation of the Constitution in 1787, the creation of the Northwest Ordinance, which I'll get into in a minute. But the Northwest Ordinance, which is the sort of plan for developing, for exercising or executing Thomas Jefferson's map, that is for expanding the Republic into the West by creating new states, that plan runs headlong into the existence of Indians on Indian territory. And as America begins to try to sort of police this territory, they immediately get into conflict with this Confederation of Native Peoples that I've discussed. There are two battles, one in 1790, one in 1791. The first under Josiah Harmer, who is the commander of the Army of the Northwest, which is pretty much the only incarnation of the Continental Army that's still in existence. That army is wiped out. The Confederation of Native Peoples that has been fighting this is a number of Native peoples from the Iroquois Confederacy, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, Ojibwe, Odawa, a whole lot of different Native peoples that are occupying territory from the Kentucky Territory through what would now be the Great Lakes, who have fought as a large alliance network from the time period of the 7 Years' War through the Revolution, have a lot of experience. And so what they meet with the largely conscript militia army in the Northwest under the command of Josiah Harmer, they defeat. There's a pretty crushing defeat in 1790 when that army is sent out to occupy forts in the Northwest Territory, both to remove squatters and clear the land for surveying so the U.S. can make it available for sale and settlement, but also to sort of make sure the Indians are in their place. And Washington sends a message to Josiah Harmer through the governor, Arthur Sinclair, to chastise these Indians, and that chastisement goes really poorly. A year later, Arthur Sinclair, who's the governor of the Northwest Territory and was a sort of military figure in the Revolution, tries to lead a second army into the Northwest to sort of teach these Indians a lesson. That army too is wiped out. One of the worst defeats in American history. He loses, he goes into the field with a little over 1,000 men and only 24 come out unharmed. So massive casualty. This double defeat pretty quickly disabuses the revolutionaries of the idea that a standing army is something that they can do away with. Remember, the sort of opposition to a standing army is a really important principle of the Revolution. In the old Northwest Territory, Americans realized that militia armies based on conscripts are not going to work in terms of expanding federal power into territory where you need to sort of actually project military power. And so America sort of pushes aside its long standing philosophical objection to a standing army, refunds the Continental Army under Anthony Wayne, and takes that army into the Northwest and wins the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where this constellation of Native peoples kind of fights to a standstill with the U.S. A large part about why America is able to prevail is that they also simultaneously negotiate the Jay Treaty with the British in 1795. This is a treaty that establishes the northern boundary, but also where Americans agree to compensate royalists for lost property, and where the British in return agree to stop supporting Indians in this Confederation alliance in territory that has been ceded to the U.S. Because to this point, the British are supplying this Confederation of Indians with weapons and supplies. And so that sort of allows the Americans to prevail. And this establishes a sort of a victory for the U.S. that allows them to negotiate a treaty called the Treaty of Greenville, negotiated in 1795. It's really important because it basically establishes what will become the basis for America's Indian policy. One, the Treaty of Greenville says it will halt settlement at the Ohio River. This is this line right here, allowing or promising the Native peoples that the territory north of the Ohio will remain Indian territory. And consequently, or in link to that, the U.S., as part of the same treaty, relinquishes claims to that Western territory. Following the Treaty of Paris, as I mentioned, which ceded all this land to the U.S. claimed that it owned title to that territory. Well, now it says they will recognize that they don't have title, that Native people have, in fact, a title to that territory. They also agree that the territory below the Ohio, which the U.S. wants to claim, as a result of the aftermath of this battle, what would now be kind of Kentucky, Southern Ohio, that they will compensate the Native people for their agreement to cede their title to that land and give it to the United States. And that will establish an annuity payment or an annual payment in compensation for land. One of the things that George Washington is advocating, even before these series of conflicts, is that it would be way less costly for Americans to expand into the West by making treaties with Indians and purchasing their land than it would be to by waging war with them. And this war has reinforced that point. War was costly in terms of American prestige, but also in terms of how much it costs Americans to settle there. And so the Treaty of Greenville sort of sets up a path forward where the US can negotiate with Native peoples. And this very much sort of is designed to work in conjunction with the earlier established Northwest Ordinance. That another final provision of the Treaty of Greenville is that the Confederated Tribes agree that they will recognize US sovereignty. That is, they recognize that the United States, not Great Britain, not France, not Spain, is the only sovereign power that they will recognize in the North American territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River Valley. They also promise that they will, if they sell land, only sell it to the United States federal government. The US government, that's the other sort of condition for them recognizing that or ceding title to land and giving it to the US, is that the Indians enter into an agreement where they promise that that land won't be taken from them, but if they do decide to sell it, they will only sell it to the federal government. They won't sell it to individuals, and they will not sell it to other foreign powers. And then another provision that's important in terms of later treaties is that America grants Native peoples the right to hunt, fish, and harvest on ceded lands that aren't settled and converted to private property. Now, again, returning back to the Northwest Ordinance, one of the things that makes the Northwest Ordinance really important once these conflicts have been settled and the US has created peace with the United States is that the ordinance is essentially a mechanism for converting indigenous land, native land, into the public domain of the United States. One of the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance, like that of the Treaty of Greenville, is that only the United States can extinguish native title and convert that land where title has been extinguished to public domain, and then make that public domain available through sale. The Northwest Ordinance is the mechanism, the legal mechanism that does this. It takes land, it sets up it creates an article that says the federal government can negotiate the cession of land from Native peoples. That is, they agree to cede title. Once you've ceded title to land, that land then enters the public domain of the United States, and then the federal government is the sole entity that can make that land available to sale to individuals, and therefore converting Indian land not only into public domain, but into sort of American homesteads. So that's a transfer of indigenous land to public domain to private property. That's envisioned by the Northwest Ordinance. It's a sort of economic agent as well as a political agent. That is, it provides the mechanism for doing this, for taking land that Americans think of as unsettled wilderness, which is in fact occupied by Indians, taking that land and converting it from wilderness/Indian territory to public domain, and then from taking public domain and making that available for sale, that it can be turned into private property by individual settlers and citizens. And another important part about this process is by establishing themselves as a monopoly for creating public domain through the extinction of native title, the US government, the federal government, is sort of granted a monopoly power, which allows it to sort of acquire land very inexpensively and to sell it very cheaply. So, as we'll get into in a couple of minutes, land that they're buying for cents per acre in places like Michigan or Wisconsin will then be sold on the market for $1 per acre. So that's an incredible markup. And land sales, in fact, have become one of the ways in which the US begins to get out of debt following the revolution. It's also a way in which it's able to create a sort of subsidized land base for their citizenry, that is, create a transfer of wealth from Native North America to the immigrant settlers in North America by transferring land, transferring that land wealth, but also providing a sort of subsidized land base. So settlers who are, in fact, sort of, as I mentioned earlier on in the lecture, settlers who are able to sort of create private property, make a sort of farm or an estate, are regarded as being much more viable or important in a republic because they have an independence. They are yeoman farmers. They're not beholden to a landlord. They're not beholden to an employer. So this is a process that both creates the sort of population that people like Jefferson and Washington imagined as being capable of exercising the sort of rights and responsibilities of a citizen of a republic, but also it creates a sort of engine for economic growth that allows American expansion into the West in a way that builds up those territories so they can be incorporated into the Union in a way that allows for citizens to sort of amass wealth and stability, but also that creates a relationship that's different from the colonial relationship that's extractive. It's extracting sort of wealth for the mother country. So it's a different sort of way of imagining an economic relationship between a metropole and a sort of hinterland or colonial territory. And this economic process is sort of linked to a series of political rights. So the Northwest Ordinance also allows for the creation of representative government. The terms of the Northwest Ordinance is that that once 5,000 free inhabitants have occupied a territory, it can be organized as a territory. Once that has happened with 5,000 free inhabitants, that territory can petition the federal government as a territory, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. And at that time, the federal government will appoint a governor and 3 judges. The citizens of that territory can elect a legislative council that advises the governor. And then when the population grows so you have a combination of local elected representation and a federally appointed executive control of territories. Once a territory reaches a population of 60,000 free inhabitants, they can then petition, they can create a state constitution and petition the federal government for admission into the Union as a state equal to all the other states, the original 13 colonies. This is the process envisioned by the electoral or by the Northwest Ordinance to create new states out of the Western territories. Now, as I mentioned, one of the conditions for the Northwest Ordinance is that this population provision, 5,000 free inhabitants, 60,000 free inhabitants to become a state. The state constitutions that get drafted in this case, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, each of those state constitutions will change the verbiage from free inhabitants to free white males. So they will explicitly change the terminology from just free to free white. So whiteness will be the qualifier for an elector, that is for a person who can hold elective office and vote, but also for persons who can testify in court, all those kinds of things. So this process is also linked to American expansion in the South, however, because the other provision that's really important in the Northwest Ordinance is that every state created through this process must have a fugitive slave clause attached to their state constitution. So while these states are being created as free states, and while you're creating a mechanism to allow American settlers to sort of gain property, subsidized property at that, in exchange for bringing the American civil society into the West and creating new states, part of that is a guarantee of Southern property in the form of chattel slavery in the South through these fugitive slave law agreements. In other words, territories of the South where America is also expanding into places like Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, that are all slave states. Enslaved individuals from those territories cannot flee into the North in order to claim their freedom, because the freedom is sort of vouchsafed by the fugitive slave clause. And then in addition to that, there are a number of other places where slavery sort of lingers in Indiana, Illinois, because there are pre-existing communities of mostly Francophone or French settlers who had slaves before America arrived on the scene and they're grandfathered in. So this sort of Mason-Dixon line between free and slave states is actually a lot more blurry in reality than it would seem on the ground. So let's see. So having kind of spelled all this out, what I want to talk about is a couple of different things real quick as we wrap up the final couple minutes here. One thing is that this system has set up a situation where one of the big questions is what to do with Native people. I mentioned that at the outset, and that's still a question. And there are essentially 2 schools of thought that emerge, and we'll see these in the documents that I've given you. One is the school that emerges with Thomas Jefferson, who imagines that a Native people are capable of sort of transcending their sort of racial inferiority, that they are capable of becoming civilized and entering into the Union as citizens. Part of what would happen would be that they would have to end up suffering a death as Native people and sort of reemerge as citizen subjects of the United States. But he does, in that sense, have a really progressive vision of American expansion, that they will not sort of remove Indians or get rid of Indians, but rather sort of incorporate them either through an assimilation that's either forced or voluntary. And he does imagine that if people resist this, they will be removed. But this Jeffersonian vision for expansion thinks that you can sort of convince Native people of the utility of becoming part of the sort of emerging political economy of the United States and really taking advantage of that. But the alternative vision for this is a vision that is sort of championed by Lewis Cass, who is a governor of the Michigan Territory, a state that remains unsettled or remains a territory until 1837, because it doesn't get the requisite population of 60,000 people for quite a long time, and therefore is really slow to join the Union. Lewis Cass's vision is that Native people are, as he experiences in Michigan, not interested in assimilating, and therefore will have to be removed in order for the republic to expand. So these are two different visions of what's happening. I'm kind of running out of my lecture time here, but I want to look through a couple of different things. So part of how this happens in the South is as America wrestles with the idea of what to do with the Native population. One answer is removal. And I'm sure that you guys are all familiar with that. If you're teaching, I know it's a standard segment when you're teaching the US survey. Removal is this period that punctuates post-revolution when you're thinking about Native people. And the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830 is this brutal process where the Native peoples are removed from what would be the old Southwest, or from that territory from Georgia through Alabama, Mississippi, up through Arkansas, removed to Indian territory. But removal is not really successfully or fully implemented in the Northwest territories. And it is partially successful in places like Ohio, but also not fully successful in places like the Michigan Territory, which the Ohio River allows people to connect to New Orleans and connect to the market economy of the United States. But if you're living in Michigan, northern Michigan in particular, you can't access the Ohio River. And so there's no point in being a farmer in central Michigan because you can't get your produce to market. And so there's very little demand for the territory until the mid 19th century, when people want that land for logging purposes because there's rail lines in the Erie Canal that can connect them. But this means that there's a large Native population that remains behind. And part of what happens here, you can see this is the 1817 treaty at the foot of the rapids. This treaty, which cedes this little period here, cedes something like 6 million acres to the United States for 6 cents an acre. This is the last bit of remaining Native territory in Ohio. Ohio's been a state at this point. That's transferring huge amounts of wealth into the United States. Similarly, you can see this is just for everybody's sort of, I'm speeding through stuff here. This is the treaty signature. So these are Native peoples, that same confederation that I talked about before, that are signing a treaty. That's a document written in English. These are their signatures. This is, if you've never seen a treaty signature sheet, this is it. This is where somebody has gone out and phonetically spelled the Native person's name and then made an X, and the Native person touches the pen that makes the X, and that's their signifier. They're accepting that treaty, that massive transfer of land. This is something that would probably not hold up in a court of law today. I'm going to skip through this one. I want to then take you quickly to another big treaty that happens in the aftermath. So this is post-removal, but you still have a large Native population in the Michigan Territory. This is the 1836 Washington Treaty. It's the last huge chunk of Native territory that's not incorporated, where Natives still retain title in the lower peninsula of Michigan. Immediately before Michigan enters the Union as a state, this vast swath of territory, 11 million acres, is sold for 7 cents an acre. Again, the US will turn around and sell that back to its citizens for $1 an acre. The annuity payments that go to pay for Native people for that, something in the neighborhood of $40,000 a year for 20 years. Of the $40,000 that's going back, for example, in the first year, something like $2,800 makes it to Native people. The other $38,000 roughly is claimed by traders and merchants who claim that Native peoples owe them that money as a sort of debt. And then finally, I'm kind of running out of my time here, but to give you a sense of how the treaty process evolves in a place like Michigan, where Indians aren't removed, and where that land nevertheless transformed from Indian territory into the modern state that we see now. I'm going to sort of, this is another treaty from 1837 with Wisconsin, but I want to kind of conclude with this map. In 1805, when Michigan Territory is created, as I mentioned, U.S. recognizes native title. So all of Michigan outside of Detroit is indigenous title land. And through a series of 11 treaties, between the Treaty of Greenville that I mentioned in 1795 and a treaty in 1842, the entirety of the state of Michigan, title is extinguished through treaty and transferred to the public domain of the U.S., administered by the federal government, and put up for sale to U.S. citizens. So in contrast, I'll wrap up. So in contrast to a place like, say, Massachusetts or Virginia, which begins as a colony and over the course of a century evolves in relationship with Native people who are sort of slowly pushed away from the East Coast, then slowly pushed even further out to the margins of the colony, and then sort of absorbed, if not entirely removed. This process happens over a period over a century. And a place like Michigan, even though removal isn't enacted, you still have this process by which in between 1805, if you were a 20-year-old Anishinaabe, that's an Indian population of Michigan, in 1805, when Michigan is created, that state would have been entirely, there's less than 5,000 white people in that state. That state is yours. You would have no reason to believe it would ever be anything but indigenous. And then in your lifetime, between 1805 and 1836, that state will go from 5,000 white people to over 200,000 white people, making you go from in a majority to a minority, with something like 30,000 Native people in that state. So you go from being 30,000 to 5,000 ratio to 200,000 to 30,000 ratio. And then also you see the entirety of the state transferred from Indian territory, the province and the property of Native peoples, to the property of individuals, or at least the state. So that transfer is really rapid. It happens really fast. But you also have intact Native populations. And one of the key things that I'll sort of end with is that unlike the Cotton South, where the money to be made is getting rid of Native peoples and creating new cotton farms, in places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, the money to be made is by this treaty process that keeps extinguishing title to land, transferring that to the public domain, promising to pay for it, but then that cash goes back not into the Indian community so much as into the state community, where it's absorbed by merchants who claim it as debt. So you have this sort of circulation of cash economy that is part of the treaty process of extinguishing title, transferring land, spending money. So that the process of expansion in the North, unlike the South, isn't through the removal of Indians, the creating of new properties, but rather the sort of circulation of cash that comes through the treaty process. So we can talk about this more as we talk about the documents, but I think I'm at the end of my time, so I'll